Good afternoon and welcome everyone. I'm Rob, one of the co-artistic producers of ARC, and we are so thrilled to welcome you into our open room. This is a process where we will be investigating the play that we are producing here at Crow's Theatre in March, Gloria. And we are so thrilled to have a special guest with us today, coming in virtually. So he is virtually for both us and for you who are watching on the live stream. Khan, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Bouba-Dalambaye. I'm born and raised and currently located in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. Just a little bit about myself. I seemingly wear way too many hats right now. So I have a background in I'm a clinical counselor, so I have a master's in counseling psychology. I have just under 10 years of experience as a local guidance counselor here in Montreal. Just about the same amount of experience managing my private practice as a mental health professional and clinical counselor. I also teach part-time as a psychology instructor at the college level, or here what's known as SAJAC. I also work as a consultant in the area of EDI and ADIA. And I also do interviews, presentations, guest speaking, consult work, and then content development, so for workshops, trainings, facilitated discussions, and educational events.
And yet you still found time to be with us today. And we are so thrilled. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to just toss it over to you, and you can start by chatting with us about your thoughts and takeaways from your perusal of the script Gloria by Brandon Jacobs Jenkins.
Okay. It was interesting. I was thinking about how I wanted to start, or maybe deliver some of my thoughts, and I kind of thought it might be interesting to start with Gloria herself, but not necessarily because it's titled Gloria. One of the things that stood out to me is that, and I'm going to try my best not to reveal too much, that it is titled Gloria, and I feel that so much of the story itself kind of emanates and stems from her and her experiences through it, but at the same time, she's both, I feel, the heart of the story, and at the same time, kind of like this dismissed or kind of pushed into the background. And then that made me start to think a lot about Gloria themselves in the play, and that one of the first things that stood out to me about Gloria was, and then the impact of it was just this overwhelming sense of both isolation and loneliness. I think one of the things that, and not just isolation and loneliness, but the particular way that she experienced it as well, what stood out to me is just the combination of how I think as human beings, we talk about basic needs, and I think the need to feel connected or to be a part of something bigger than yourself, or to feel that you're a part of a community is, I would argue, is its own basic need, and that what that often brings, amongst other things, is not just connectivity, but to a certain degree, it somewhat validates our existence in who we are, and that's kind of being on this earth, if you will, without getting too meta. But I do think it's so important. I think there's so many ways in which it's ingrained in the fabric of society, the importance of integration into a group or socially. And so when I think of Gloria, I think of her not necessarily having that, but more than that, I think it can be almost described as torturous. The fact that it's not just, I think it's one thing to be denied something that you really need and desire and strive or long for, like this yearning and the inability to satisfy it. But as well, when it's so close to you, like I just kept thinking about, like, almost as though existing as this moat, and so surrounded by land, but no drawbridge or bridge to kind of cross, and so being surrounded by people at the workplace, and for decades or so, years of that, and yet almost as though they were a painting on the wall, and that's something that you might not pay that much attention to, that's something that might stand out to you every now and then, but not like this significant piece of your reality experience there. And so that experience of this fly on the wall kind of phenomenon, but watching people live the lives or have the success or engage in ways and have the importance that you don't and I think long for, I think is so damaging because it's just one, the starving or the depravity, if you will, of not getting that nourishment for who you are in terms of a human being as a person or emotionally in that validation. But at the same time, it's like if you were starving, you hadn't eaten in a week, but you were kept just, like there's plates of food that are kept just out of your reach or so. And just like the torture that might create and what you have to endure, knowing that it's so close and yet it feels also completely inaccessible. And that's something that really stood with me when I was thinking about them as a character and their story within it. Also, how she was versus how she was seen, right? Like there was such strong impressions and visions and then sentiments and like narratives about who Gloria was as a person, and yet it also seemed that was based on absolutely nothing or bits of information that are shallow or hollow or superficial at best, because of what I just spoke to before in terms of this isolation. And it made me start to think about how often it is that we form impressions and understandings of the world around us, people within it, right? Without ever having any type of significant knowledge or interaction with those people. So many people have this stark idea of who Gloria was, and then their dynamic with Gloria or their understanding of them without any significant interaction, without any investment into that belief or that perception of who she was. And I think that is something that is very reflective of society as a whole, right? Like, whether we just think to like basic normal human behavior, the assumptions that people make, whether we extrapolate that and go a bit further in terms of looking at the universal presence and existence of bias or unconscious bias and how that feeds into and taints or colors the lens that we use to view our world and our understanding of it. I feel like as much as in some ways this kind of dichotomy of her being a part of it and then her being also like this kind of side piece of it. I feel that despite being a side piece, so much emanates from who this character was and wasn't, what this character was given and was not given. So yes, like I think there's a big heartfelt piece that goes towards Gloria and her existence and her, the fact that she was almost never in control of her own narrative. Mm-hmm. And I think in so many different ways that's something that we can as human beings understand, and I think without, I would say it's politicizing it, but I think also there's certain groups, maybe certain marginalized groups, certain oppressed groups who feel that a little bit more in terms of walking this earth and spending your entire life not having control over the one thing that should rightfully be ours, which is our narrative. And how damaging that could be, how that in and of itself represents this kind of injustice because we are denied of the one thing that is so truly and uniquely ours, which is our own voice, or at least that it should be, right? And then what is the damage that is caused in terms of how we see ourselves, issues of self-worth, our ability to kind of grow into and blossom into our full selves if we're denied our voice, and our voice often being like a catalyst towards being able to accomplish all of that. Sounds preachy, but I hope that makes sense. I also think about, along the lines of not controlling your own narrative, I think they as a character also represent how easy it is for us to maybe, I shouldn't say how easy, but the potential for us to begin to internalize the way in which we are seen and treated in life, like the way in which we kind of exist in our realities based on how people treat us and see us, and the internalization of that, right? Like everything from without getting into it too much, some of the language that was often used, or some of the adjectives that were often used to describe Gloria, or the look that she gave, and then how indirectly she was also painted under that same light, or that same adjective, in terms of the incident and her subsequent actions. And I think of the power of that as well, right? So how much we internalize those things. I think about how outside of one character, there was seemingly no sympathy for her. Like, and maybe that's just my own take from it, but it seemed like there was absolutely no sympathy for her. There was one character who captures it in the story, but it didn't seem like anybody else felt it. And so, to me, that kind of reflected the fact that, again, like her isolation, like being surrounded by people, but no one connected enough to her or her humanity to actually care about what happened to her or her story, right? There seemed to be no weeping, no attempt or desire to understand, no movement towards like sympathy or educating, or kind of not perpetuating the transgressions or the faults of the past relative to her. And it's kind of heartbreaking that she doesn't get that. And it's interesting, right? Like, based on the incident, I think there's very much multiple lenses of who could be / who is maybe a victim, and how that position of victimhood or being a victim is understood, how it is kind of justified, almost as if like there's this stark criteria that is used to be like, this is why I qualify and fit in this category, but why other people don't. And it's interesting that I don't feel that she was ever given the opportunity to be also seen as a victim. We see other people, like, we don't look at her. You know what? It's kind of like, okay, I'm not going to look, there's this book that I've been reading, and it kind of shifts the way that people view things. And so we look at people with odd or outlying behavior or problematic aspects to who they are, and we make these snap judgments, and we look at them in terms of what's wrong with you. And the book that I'm reading far more, and I'll get into this a bit later, but it far more explains and approaches the situations in terms of what happened to you. And I think it's such an important shift that doesn't often exist I feel in society, because we're so quick to blame and attribute blame and then start to label. So like kind of almost as if that putting that in a box gives us a sense of peace, and we don't take the time or the effort, or we don't make the investment, or we don't engage in the labor, if you will. We're not willing to sacrifice what's most precious to us, which is often our time and our ability to show empathy, to understand people. I feel that question of what happened to you is so important in that sense, because it shifts it from blame to understanding that we're a product of our experiences. We're a product of our environments, right? We're a product of our cultures. So what are the things that led you to becoming or behaving in the way that you did, or becoming the person that you did, rather than just looking at like a snapshot of the final product and assuming that we know everything. And that, I think that also speaks to a little bit about, there's just this little brief glimpse into who she was as a person. You get it a bit from the one character who shows to truly care, and you get it a bit almost in one line that is mentioned about her past, or maybe her experiences growing up. But you also see that there's seemingly like no care about that. And I think that if we don't position ourselves in a way like bring us to mental health or to society as a whole, I think you see that so much. Like there's not enough attempt, focus, prioritization or value being put in understanding an individual's narrative and how that leads to like the event or the act or like the culmination of that, which is what you're witnessing right now. And I think that is so telling in her story, in that all of that is missed. It's almost as if it's not important. Everybody else's story is explored and dove into and is valued in terms of like emotionally or symbolically or financially, except for hers. Like you almost to the point that like even the story itself of what happened in the incident almost seems to like, in the same way you can't remove her because she's a massive part of it, but in the same way she seems just so apart, again, like in the giant story, being the heart of it and just being like almost like a side piece. And that's something that really stood out to me, I think, with Gloria, and also the fact that there seems to be that, and it's not explicitly said, but it's almost alluded to that there could be a piece in terms of mental health that might be playing a part in this, and yet also speaking to sometimes the still prevalent stigma around mental health, and then also as well that not being understood or explored to understand people as a whole, right? Like the incident in Gloria's subsequent actions are very much stigmatized, but there's no room made for understanding. In the same way, when we speak about the isolation, there was no effort or room made to understand that individual who had been there for decades upon decades and had been in some ways the heart of that area, of that institution, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to skip to that point because that's a little bit too revealing. Well, no, I'm being cautious, right? Like you don't want spoilers. I'll shift a little bit away from Gloria right now, but I'm sure there's some pieces will come back later, but I think those are the major things that stood out to me about Gloria. And so in one way, I think there's so much, similar to Gloria, I think there's so much to her story, but it's subtle. It's not something that screams at you or necessarily slaps you in the face like other aspects, but if there's a willingness and a desire and taking the time to appreciate her, then there's an ability to truly appreciate her story as well. And maybe that was by design by the creator of this player production. Something else that stood out to me was a little bit of talking about social justice or some of social justice, but maybe in terms of bias or discrimination or racism. So it stood out to me how one of the characters, Kendra, was described as a tiger, right? And that being inappropriate, and then when that was kind of brought up, how quickly it was just dismissed or explained away, right? Like rather than like the acknowledgement and the acceptance that no, that's inappropriate, right? And that kind of also speaks to like a dismissal of responsibility that we often see so much in society in terms of not taking responsibility for our lack of knowledge or something that might be hurtful to somebody else, but because to us, we hide behind our intentions of what we're trying to do, or we explain it away as kind of, well, this is the reason for it, so I'm almost absolved the responsibility for fault, rather than acknowledge that like, oh my bad, thank you for pointing that out to me. Let me move forward with that in some way. So I think that was brief and telling. I think Kendra's like need to constantly compete and prove herself within her work environment, and how almost feeling like reactive or triggered by other people getting opportunities above her, and feeling almost as though all that she's done and represents isn't enough, and so like this almost reflexive need to lower other individuals in order, as if that's the only way that she could possibly stand out in terms of being seen and equal, or the merits of her work and what she's done and accomplished for herself. That's something that stood out to me. Dean feeling threatened by Miles, which is really interesting when they point out as well that both that feeling threatened by Miles and how that was a different way in which he had interacted, or the dynamic he'd had with other interns, as well as how he was treated. Like I felt like it's interesting that you have somebody who is this kind of um, who found a way, and it was like this is excelling in so many ways to be able to be put and given that position. Um, and the school that they came from, and yet was treated like a gopher or an errand boy, if you will, was just a menial task. And then it made me, well, if you want to get into it, it made me think a little bit about this notion of like servitude relative to certain groups or racial groups as well. And that it was just, and then it didn't stand out to anybody, that it might be highly inappropriate to make a Black individual your like it like in a position of servitude or like a gopher, and just like this almost like quasi demeaning reductionist approach to that individual, and no one saw it as inappropriate, or even that the other visible minority didn't notice that. And then that made me think too, as well, as that when put in a situation for scarcity of resources, we don't, being able to, sorry.
Oh, sorry. I just vocalized. Sorry. I just said, yeah, like, yeah.
I feel like when you grow up in an environment where there's a scarcity of resources, the fact that I don't think people always like, and this can talk to privilege, not everybody understands that it's a privilege to be able to have the time and the resources and the bandwidth to be able to help somebody else, right? Volunteering in and of itself in some ways is a privilege. And so it's interesting, in some ways, feel that someone from another member of a marginalized group or a visible minority might be sensitive or attuned to that. But are you so trapped in like your own depravity and the survival mode of having to make sure that you get your own, which I think Kendra really captures and embodies, and so that was also missed as well. What else stood out to me? Also, the importance attributed to Miles. Like, we don't even know what his name is necessarily, or the fact that the name was forgotten. But it seems like it was the only name that was forgotten, as well as how he was written out of the story.
Yeah.
Right. And like, if you want to make like a parallel or connection to a bigger picture, right? You can say like how Miles is written out of the story despite his essential contribution. And like that's like a microcosm of just North America and how so many visible minorities or the Black community has just been written out of history and their contribution and just completely marginalized. So that what are we left with capturing is that at best he was an intern who was under everybody else or not quite at their level. I also think a little bit of social class, like I really stuck with me that during the incident, only certain people were deemed important to be notified. I was like, that threw me for a loop, and I had to pause for a little bit before continuing on. But the fact that like this kind of qualifying or like attributing value to people or to human life, and it is just so interesting that only certain people were deemed necessary and important to notify of what was going on during the incident, and how everybody else was kind of left for themselves, and kind of thinking about like the structure of society and how like sometimes the more like those who are the privileged or deemed like the elite, if you will, are treated, or how they see themselves, and the importance of kind of preserving themselves relative to everybody else, and how everybody else really is left in society to fend for themselves. The lack of value that's placed on relationships or like interconnectedness. So it's interesting to me that like a lot of the relationships that you witnessed were either superficial or only based on a specific context, whether that was work, or quite negative or toxic in terms of like the aggressive, almost like verbally violent nature that at times people would speak with each other. Like inappropriate language, attacking of like, let's say like mental health or addiction. Like it just, and it was interesting that like that was seemed to be like the main currency in terms of how people exchange themselves with one another. And there was almost no value. You almost feel like it's kind of lost up until an individual character that kind of is like this redeeming point in all of it. But I think the fact that like, as I mentioned before, like this sense of feeling connected, like we don't live in a vacuum, we lived in a social world, and yet it seemed that the only way that is valued is either like the very superficial or a way of kind of just dumping our frustrations or our negative emotions onto somebody, or if it's profitable. Notice how like people, there's like this immediate like on a dime pivot or shift in terms of how people were viewed and related to the moment that it was deemed or seen that there was value to or what they can bring, and that value was far more in terms of issues of sensualization or glorification of certain things, marketability or profit, um, personal like and self-advancement and promotion as well. And that's and like it's almost as though that's the extent of where it is. Like I only see you as far as your benefit to me or what I'm trying to accomplish. And I do feel that it's so often at times in life you see that and you experience it. And it's also to me a product of the fact that I think our ability to truly understand and care about things or individuals is predicated on that a certain level of intimacy or connectiveness, right? Like there's so many things that we hear, whether it's like horrors or atrocities, there's so many causes that we hear about that are really important, and yet it's only until we find a way of connecting or relating to it. It's only when there's something that constitutes a shared experience or some form of identification with that, that all of a sudden we open up ourselves and we expose our humanity and we connect that and we see it in the other person as well. It's though their worth and like our ability to recognize them is solely based on our ability to see ourselves and connect to it. And if we can or if we don't, then we don't value that interaction or that person or that relationship. And I think that is so important for society as a whole, but also for us as individuals and understanding the importance of having that connectivity and the despair and how we can spiral and some of the detriments to not having that or not feeling that you have that and not feeling that you have the means to access it, if that makes sense to people. What else? Sorry, I keep checking down because I wrote some notes to make sure I forget everything. I'm not just like stoically or so just looking.
To the right.
I'm taking away all my secrets. What else did I? Also the like almost like a drug or a need in of itself for a sense of purpose or fulfillment or validation. And I think you see it across all the characters. I think, and again, I'm being cautious, so I'm not going to go into the details. But I think I can name the characters, correct?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
I think that you see it in Gloria, that desire and that need and what happens when it seems like the final straw or so, or that last attempt and it just fell through. I think you see that need I think you very much see that need in Lauren when he expresses a little bit about his career situation. I think you see that need in Dean as well, in terms of his efforts and attempts relative to his career. And I think you see that need as well within Kendra, most definitely. What's odd is though it almost seems as though it's really focused on their career or their professional selves. And sometimes I feel that that's like symbolic of how we can often lose ourselves in our work. Also noticing that so many people dedicated like their lives to their work. And this is my bias because I've been very privileged or fortunate enough to be able to accomplish this, but no one gave me a sense that their work was a marriage of who they were or who they wanted to be. No one gave me a sense that their work and how they dedicated into that was like this natural extension or expression of who they are as a person. And so through that, rewarding or validating or nourishing. And so they invest and give all themselves into something that actually takes away from who they are, only to invest more in the exact same direction and be almost being caught in this vicious cycle and not seeing how it kind of winds them down or like creates this own spiral. Kind of like a sense of like continuously trying to dig yourself out of a hole and just find yourself deeper in it, but engaging in the same process.
Mm.
And then again, like that's why I also very much like Lauren, in terms of like representing that, but also the process of internalization and I think growth. And I think that's so powerful for me in that character, is that it's also something that's important in that by being aware and being attuned and kind of allowing things to stop or take a break and absorb it and take it in, right? Like I feel like that was some of the things that allowed that person to grow and allow that person to grow. And it's also like the only person who didn't perpetuate their own difficult experience. They're the only person in one way or other I felt that didn't engage in like this deliberate or unconscious and unknowing process of continuing to relive what is one of the most difficult experiences. Which brings us to trauma. I think that one of the biggest things that everybody will take away maybe from this, or kind of maybe just screams at you a little bit, when either you're reading through it, or for those who are eventually going to have the pleasure and the joy of having these fine, amazing people in front of me perform and put themselves and their souls into this work. But that's also something that stood out to me, is that the aspect of trauma, right? So this lasting emotional and physiological or physical response to a really difficult or significant event. And then it also spoke to the way in which traumatic events can stay with us. So when I was reading that, and then again, because of the book I referenced before with What Happened to You, it very much speaks about the power of early experiences, but in particular trauma. And so the way that I took it was understanding the trauma that the characters had experienced from the incident. And then from there, it spoke to two things. It spoke very much and allows you to understand a little bit about how trauma can work. But it also spoke to, as well, as that there seems to be, I hope I'm not ruining things. There seems to be no mental health awareness throughout the entirety of this reality or this world.
Yeah.
It is not mentioned, whether explicitly or implicitly. It is not intonated. Nothing connotes towards it. It is not symbolically or indirectly or subtly kind of demonstrated or engaged or like valued. And obviously, like with a clinical background, that's something that stood out to me. But there's like no trace of it or no understanding of it. And so you see the different ways in which the characters have moved on beyond that moment, and how their moving on hasn't allowed them to move on in any way, shape, or form. Because what essentially that they're doing is they're re-triggering their own trauma, and they're causing themselves to have to relive their own trauma. They're kind of stimulating or engage or serving as a catalyst for their own PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, by causing themselves to have to relive those experiences. We as human beings have the strongest and most accurate or vivid, powerful memory for emotion more than anything else. That is the greatest detail. It's the reason why if you ask somebody to recount a memory, if it's positive, they'll embody it. But if it's negative, they'll shy away and not talk about it, because you're actually asking them to relive a damaging or traumatic experience. And so what's interesting for me is that a traumatic experience, like this can be like whether it's kind of repeated trauma existing or staying lasting too long in an environment that is traumatic or damaging or stressful. But even a singular event, if powerful or shocking enough, I feel what people don't understand is that it rewires you. So it changes the way in which you can understand yourself, but also changes the way in which you understand, view, and relate to the world, right? It causes this shock where maybe it changes or impacts the sense of safety or your understanding of how the world works, how you do or need to exist within it. But it also rewires us, right? Sorry, it's constant sense of anxiety or threat, danger to self or risk. It also rewires us physiologically. And I think that's something that people don't understand. That event, right? Like in that moment, the way that we react to it is, if it's so significant, we as human beings are designed to be adaptive. So that can rewire and make us more sensitive to certain triggers. And you see that throughout, whether it's certain locations, whether it's a type of music or a song or a sound, right? Whether it's certain tastes or foods or liquids. All of that, when you see that kind of being able to be a trigger, it's because one, it's the way our mind works. Our mind works based on associations. As an adaptive function, we have all the stored memories and experiences that we have and information. Everything that comes in is automatically mapped on to see how it matches and fits. Because based on that, that is a way of protecting us, knowing what is good or bad, what is healthy or a threat. And you see that. And so some of those things serve as triggers the moment that you're presented there, because it's associated with something that was very damaging or potential risky. I'm going to go a little bit scientific here. So it can rewire us so that way we become, we have to, like, we feel like what we needed to do and adapt in that moment is what we still need to do in every moment. So being more sensitive or prone to stress or triggers, being more hyper aware, living in a constant state of stress, living or feeling in a constant state of awareness or fear, because in the moment of certain incidents, that's what people needed to do to survive, but not understanding that we no longer exist in those moments. So when we register information from the environment, we register it from our senses. And where that information goes automatically is our brainstem, which is the most basic or primitive part of our brain system, which is one we share with animals. That is designed and creates for our reactions, fear, aggression, so emotionally based, and also self-preservation in terms of fight or flight. The higher processing in terms of planning or judgment, behavior, who we are, exists up in the cortex, which also includes a sense of time. So when we register all of that information, we don't have a sense of time of when it is occurring in our narrative. We just know that it's occurring and it maps to something that is dangerous. And we respond and we react, and that's how the triggers work. And you see that in the play, right? But there's no awareness or understanding to that. Just the fact that I'm feeling the effect and not entirely certain as to why it is. The other thing is that when you become triggered, it actually shuts down higher level functioning. So everything can be mobilized towards, blood and energy towards muscles. And then, like, again, a fight or flight response. And so that was something that stood out to me in terms of there's so many instances of where trauma has occurred and continues to reoccur. It's even like subtly hinted at the possibility with Gloria herself, when you go all the way back to her earlier experiences. We might not even consider that one of the incidents that seems to be the catalyst or like the final straw for Gloria in terms of what she had tried to set up and that falling through without revealing too much. That can even be traumatizing. And so I think it's so fascinating that it's such a, and I think that maybe the author really meant to do this, and that trauma is so prevalent in our lives, and sometimes it's because we don't understand it. Other times we kind of put it towards these massive or huge events, not understanding that the accumulation of small events can also be traumatic and lead to trauma and carrying it, as well as certain events that we feel that we could or should be able to get over, but still have this lasting effect. We don't have to be consciously aware of trauma in order for it to exist and impact us in our lives, and then how we move about within our lives as well. But then it also speaks to as well as like this mental health awareness or lack thereof, because it's never discussed. There's no support offered to everybody who endured the incident at any point, right? Like business takes back up in the environment the incident occurred, yet emotions can be contained not just in experiences or moments. Emotions can be contained in locations. You can have a certain spot in your house that contains a lot of powerful emotion, whether it's some of your fondest memories or maybe where you suffered or struggled the most. And going back there, whether it's in your house, whether it's in a workplace, whether it was maybe school, which is really difficult for people, there's a lot of emotionality that are also contained in environments that will also trigger us based on how we were wired, because that environment was damaging or unsafe. And we're constantly trying to adapt in order to preserve self, even if it isn't the most adaptive way. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
We have a question here for you, Tom.
For sure. I was just gonna ramble, so that's pretty good.
Rambling is great. The rambling's great, but I will forget the question. So I'm gonna ask now, when you talked about the characters reliving the experience, reliving the trauma, can you speak more to that? Do you mean because they're writing the story, like they're writing the book, or can you speak more about what you mean about the characters reliving the trauma?
So, okay, I'll try and I'm trying to get into too many specifics to ruin it for people, but so just please direct my answer. But that's a part of it. I think it's everything, right? Like I think it's from the things that might be more explicit, like writing a story. And there's think about everything that might have to go into writing a story. I'm sure you guys would understand this far more than I would, but there's the writing the story, and there's the rough copy, and there's the rough drafts, and then there's the edits, and there's the back and forth conversations, right? Until it's finalized. That can be traumatizing experiences, every aspect that you do. And then there's the book tours, and then there's the interviews and on TV and the appearances that can trigger that. It's the conversations about it as well. If you haven't had the opportunity to process in a safe manner with someone who can help guide you through it, doesn't mean that people can't get over through trauma on their own, but it's also that, like, those conversations, depending on the individual and what they've gone through or what they haven't, also is reliving. It's running into people that you didn't anticipate and expect, and the shock to your system of that, because again, they are associated with this incident, and then boom, you're right, like, and that throws our whole system into shock, because once again, our system of understanding the world never prepared us for this incident. And so how can we trust ourselves in our system if it failed us so incredibly? And then it failed us again every time it's triggered or we're re-traumatized again. And then how can we trust ourselves, or how can we trust the world? Because at any given moment, something can happen, or that sense of threat comes back, and I don't trust the world not to do that to me, and I don't trust myself to be able to recognize and avoid it. Then the little triggers, like I said, certain substances, certain songs, certain names, certain locations, brings you back there and could be reliving it. Definitely the telling of the story. Yeah, does that help? Yes.
Maybe a part B to that. It sort of, I had a larger extrapolation I wanted to ask you to do for us, if you wouldn't mind, about the you're on your own aspect of the story. It came up yesterday in terms of like the mental health that people are offered after a traumatic event. A lot of times you're on your own with how you get to process that. So in general, I think that's a running theme. I think it runs into how you're on your own when you get this job, how you move up. You're on your own when you move up to not be an alcoholic, who only, you know what I mean? Like all these things about isolation, which you mentioned in the beginning. So to piggyback, or to add a B parentheses to Aviva's question, with regards to how they're reliving it. To me, it speaks to, like, I would imagine that there's a healthy process of writing the story that you've lived through. Mm-hmm. And I would imagine that monetizing that isn't part of the healthy process of, of using your experience and writing it down and reliving the memories. I'm doing, for my own mental health research, like I'm seeing people in the States that are using macro dosing of MDMA to have people with PTSD relive traumatic events in order to overcome them more holistically, because they actually get to relive them in a way, in a controlled environment, of course, with doctors and whatnot. But back to this, is that part of it? Like, because, you know, without giving away too much on our end, there are examples on the other end of the event of how people decided to deal with the trauma. I suspect that's another divergence we could take about who has access to deal with it and move across the country to forget about it. But, right, so I guess my question is, at what point could that have been a healthy thing for these young writers in a magazine to say, use your craft to deal with this trauma, right? I don't know what my question is, but I guess the theme, like, I'm just trying to, like, you know, get you to talk more about it.
Well, can I throw something in the mix for you? Like, one thing from another play of his, Off the Room, which I keep referencing of like a play I've done before. One of the things, he opens that play with a conversation with a therapist, and he breaks down this particular thing he's having an issue with. And so he takes the audience on this little journey, and then he makes a twist. And then he says, just kidding, I don't have a therapist, I can't afford one. So, like yesterday, no, but like, yes, but at the same time, as I mentioned yesterday, when was the last time any of these people went to the hospital? So,
for a medical doctor.
Or, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, what do they have to do in order to save themselves?
That's my question is, like, how, you're on your own, right?
Right? So what do you have to do to save yourself? Do you need to sell your story to get money so you can get to see a therapist?
Right.
You know, so where is the...
Yeah. And that's the thought process. I mean, go ahead, sorry, Tom.
I'm gonna try and put that together and answer it. So, in terms of like you're on your own, I'll start there. I think that very much speaks to us living in an individualistic society, and so oftentimes what's kind of promoted or almost this burden of responsibility to have to be independent and you have to do it all on your own, and that is the ultimate measure of success, and then the deification of self. And I think that speaks to that, and also how everybody was, like you said, from the moment like they're brought in to the company, as well as to like everything afterwards, everyone was left to their own devices, right? There is power and there can be healing that definitely involves revisiting the event, or right, the writing of your story or the rewriting, but it's balance. And it seemed like there was a lack of balance in that. Without guidance and support on how to do that, it feels like everybody was left to their own devices, and for them maybe a way of making sense or having something positive or that they can digest as a takeaway from this was, okay, well, at least it made me money, or it led to like this promotion in my career, or like career.
Right? Like public support, like you were saying before, being part of a collective experience that makes you feel like, we talked about yesterday, the sense of belonging. And like, if you're all on your own in a city like New York and nobody cares about what you've been through, that might be a way to let people know.
Well, it's along what you said. Sorry, I cut you off. My apologies. Please continue.
I'm the master. No, please. I'm the king of cutting people off. Like, I'm not. And this new technology is not helping us.
I think what you said is telling, just in that it's also right, like if there's such a focus on the individual, then I don't think we understand that there can be one, like there's such a focus on the individual, and this puts blinders, and so it blocks us off to being attuned to the needs of everybody else. And I think you see that in kind of post-incident, but also the lead up to it as well, and kind of people had their blinders to everybody else and their needs, or their blinders to Gloria, right? Because you're in this environment that it's me, and it's driven that way, and that's the only one way of success. There's no such thing as like this collective or community success almost. And then you see it in how things are approached in terms of people being left to their devices rather than like a community of healing, if you will, or a community approach. Um, I think balance is important, and so the revisiting or the retelling of the story can be absolutely healing. And like there is like successive approximations towards, what you might be afraid of or phobic, or what has may have traumatized you, as a way of kind of um, reauthoring that experience, if you will. But you have to be guided in that, or life just has to kind of work out where you get that, or your life sets it up that way where you're able to do it. And that wasn't given. Also, this notion that there's no sense of responsibility to others. There's absolutely no sense. And you see it from the individual level all the way like up to like the organizational or like company level, right? Like they didn't, like, what did they do other than open back up for business?
Yeah.
I hope that answers your question. I apologize. Yeah. Okay.
No, I don't, yeah, that's,
Yeah.
thank you, that's amazing. It's a common thread that we're touching with all our guests too, like yesterday, about that environment can just let people, the best of people, let others flail when they're needing help, and you've got your own blinders on with your own survival, right, in that own environment, and yeah, it's easy to forget each other,
I think
unfortunately.
that's the dangers of a meritocracy. This belief or this illusion that everybody exists in a meritocracy and everyone has equal opportunity to control like their destinies or their fates and realities and like make of it what they will. But then on the other end of that, kind of just holding people accountable and responsible, almost as if like, all right, well, you're up to your own devices, or this is on you, or that's not my burden or my bag of my issues, my bag to deal with, and just kind of leaving people at the side. Because again, with this deification of self, anything outside of me is an hindrance or an obstacle to me. You know what I mean?
It's
And
another trophy, right? It's another, it's somebody else's, yeah, it's credit taken away from that individual.
Yeah.
unless it's self-serving, unless it's self-serving, right?
Well, that's the transactional nature of the thing that we were talking about too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else that we stopped you midway? Anything else that you wanted to add in your notes? What was up?
I think the other thing that spoke out to me as well is like we covered some of the triggers, um, some of the consequences as well, right? Like we saw one of the characters have a breakdown, right? Like we saw some of the characters still being triggered, or so their inability to talk or engage with anything that relates um, to that incident. Also, the blocking out or blacking out of like a lot of the events as well, right? Like again, we as human beings, our minds, they're adaptive. They're there to preserve and to help us. And so like those are some of the strategies, whether it's making our minds making those associations to avoid like threat or dangers, or whether it's our minds like our bodies being triggered as a warning sign to be like, you're getting too close to what we've associated or categorized as a danger. You need to pull back, and I'm going to make you go through something in order to understand that this is not where you're supposed to go. As well as it's interesting that like when you saw at the end of it people trying to engage in more human conversations, and they floundered or almost struggled, and it was like really awkward to just talk as humans and to talk about what you'd been through, and it was like almost super uncomfortable. Whereas like let's say in the workplace and just kind of, part of my friends shitting on each other and like offloading on each other, that was like so authentic almost. And yet the idea of sitting down and like humanizing yourself or connecting to somebody else or talking about a difficulty or a struggle or a vulnerability, it was either used against them in some portions of the story, right? Like severely, right? Um, or it was just so uncomfortable that they actually couldn't do it. And also how, and so I think that stood out to me, and just like the breakdown and the blocking out, disconnecting completely from that experience, people distancing themselves in some way, or trying to find value in what happened as ways of like people struggling to kind of grasp and cope with what happened, is something that stood out to me. Also, as well, that it seems as though, okay, I'm not going to go, I think this will capture it because you guys know what I'm talking about. And when I look at kind of like everything we've talked about and then like the redeeming character, and then I look at how it ends, to me, it's very much the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Yeah.
There's like so much significant events that happen and things that have changed and movement, literally or figuratively. And then yet you're left with this kind of like this almost, can I capture what my emotional reaction to it was?
Mm-hmm.
Almost like a sense of like disappointment. I was just kind of a sense of like I was disappointed in humanity, and I know that seems kind of strong, but like I was just like I was you know when you're disappointed and not surprised at the same time.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, man. You give that kind of smirk and you just purse your lips like, yeah.
Yeah.
We were in theater, Con, in case you, we know the feeling very well.
Con, can I ask, because you do consultancy in workplaces, and part of your work is about sort of breaking some of those cycles, right? Like finding inroads into better mental health support, and certainly the work that you do in EDI as well. And I'm curious about what kind of ways do you assess a given workplace? Like if you're sort of going into a situation, looking to find those areas for support or to break those cycles of things staying the same, well, how do you make those initial assessments? Like where do you see sort of some of the, I guess, the less blatant things that are problematic in a workplace? The littler microaggressions and the bits and pieces. How do you find those things?
It's a little difficult because you gotta spend time and kind of get like ingrained that in that culture a little bit. But so, I mean, I try to avoid kind of just solely going in with my biases in the way that I'm just naturally going to see it, and also working with what I'm being asked to kind of focus on, but not like rigidly staying there. But I think like in terms of my background and my bias, I think a lot of it is going to be like what are the safe channels of communication that actually exist, so that allows for people to feel that there is value to who they are, even if that is unique or somehow that falls outside of, let's say, the norm or so, because you've built it in the structure and you've created a culture that shows that it prioritizes that there's an importance or value given to people being able to have their voices heard or give feedback and to a certain degree have needs met. I think it's the supports and the sense of responsibility that an organization or an institution might take on in terms of what do they do in promoting wellness, supporting their employees, whether that's like vacation days, like social events, promotions or rewards, access to EAP services, so employee assistance program services. So that way you're supporting those individuals into taking care of their personal or life issues, so that they can then bring more of themselves to work, and you have the right to ask for the entirety or their full selves to be at work, because you've supported that. I think it creates, like, it reflects as well like this two-way dynamic where each person is responsible for the other and the other person's needs, right? It's not just the employee or the staff is asked to give and give. I think that's important. And then like, how do you capture wellness, right? Like, how do you give people breaks? How do you promote that? How do you not just communication in terms of problems, but how do you create connectivity, right? Like, what are like established lines of communication, not just like down up, or top down in terms of like necessary information, initiatives, responsibilities, or issues, or work or needs, but also across in terms of like how do you allow people to communicate and connect? How do you allow them to have fun? How do you allow them to see them beyond a certain department or role or title or position? That's my bias. So I think those are some of the things that I think are really important. But I think that's definitely like, it's not the end all be all of it, but it's definitely, I think, part of, I think it's a really important ingredient in terms of how to go about baking that wellness cake, if you will.
Samuel? I had a question. In talking about trauma, can there be positivity in trauma? Like, is trauma always negative, or?
Um, I think I would kind of like make trauma akin to like maybe failure or difficult experiences or like a lack of success or so, in that it's okay, how can I put this? I often tell people or my clients that um, oftentimes the meaning that we attribute to and the value, the importance of a certain event or instance in our life is determined by what we do after it, right? And so there's how we capture and react to it in the moment and like the not so distant future from there. But then we also have a lot of authorship and power in terms of like what we do beyond that. Like when I worked in high schools, I would always tell my students, it seems to me like the common denominator, like the common theme or thread amongst all the people that we deem as like heroes and role models and people to look up to and all these things is that they usually had extremely adverse situations or conditions or experiences that they've turned around and look back on now and say that those are some of the most important things or defining experiences in an appropriate or healthy way. And so I do think that trauma can be informative, it could be positive, right? Like I think there's, like they say, there's levels to this. So I think there's different degrees or levels to like how impactful or how significantly someone's traumatized by something. And then as well, like the steps you take in terms of your ability to acknowledge, to accept that, instead of to move on, to be able to incorporate into your life narrative and carry on with that experience in a way that is healthy and not damaging or doesn't cause you to avoid it by rejecting it. I think yes, it can be very positive because I think all of those things taken out of this discussion and put somewhere else, you would probably say like, oh, those are aspects of personal growth, right? Or like learning and insight or wisdom, perhaps. Yeah, you got to survive it, right? Like kind of like we can all look back to some of like the worst or really bad experiences that we've had, and some we're still dealing with, but others we've found a way of making sense or taking meaning or growth or being like, this is now my purpose because I will not allow this to happen to me or like other people. However, you've captured it in that healthy way that allows you to carry on with it. I do think, I really do. I'm also biased because I'm in a field of change, and I have to be positive and be able to induce hope for people. Will everybody get there? No. I'm just be real with you. For different reasons, right? Like, depending on what you've gone through, depending on the resources that you had, depending on the available support, depending on whether or not getting professional support is stigmatized in your culture or within your group or like your clan, if you will, right? Like all these things. Mental health supports are really expensive, and they actually, we talk about health as being something that is universally applicable and important to individuals. And we talk about how the importance of mental health being seen as just health, but we don't treat it that way because it's not a part of Medicare, right? Or it's treated as a part, or only like a small subset of the actual population can actually afford it in a consistent and significant manner. That's another rant for another time.
But that's also what the play's about. I mean, you talked about before, Con, about being left to their own devices, and it makes me think they're left to their own resources.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Their own devices because of their resources, the lack thereof. And as someone who has the benefit of having access to mental health and, excellent coverage, if I can say, I recognize the gap, the failing. I have friends that are going through a lot more than I'm going through right now who can't afford a therapist. And if only they could, it would change. I can tell them how much it would change because it did it for me, right? So since I've stopped you, and it is related to this, is there anything, I guess a question I might have, is there anything in the script that the play itself on paper may be missing, or are there any blind spots that you might see that we could keep an eye on as a production? Like any tropes, any sort of like, things that are representing, I mean, I think it comes off as super authentic to me, but I'm not in the field, right? So, is that a clear enough question? Like, is there anything as a production that we should, or maybe because things have changed since you wrote it? We live in 2021, we're playing it pre-Trump and pre-COVID, which are two massive markers of mental health, before and afters, I think, for a lot of people. But in a pre-Trump and pre-COVID environment, in an office in Manhattan, it's really intense. Like like the way they speak to each other is toxic from the beginning, but it's normalized in the play because it's normalized in our society, right? And I guess the question is, do you think it goes too far? Does it go far enough? As a Canadian company, can we, is there a danger of not leaning into the aggression far enough? That's something I'm worried about personally, is that we're a bunch of really nice people putting on a play about a toxic work environment in a city like Manhattan. I'm not worried about it. But I don't know. I mean, yeah, I'll let.
No, I'll try my best to answer that. Well, I will say is that when you talk about as a Canadian company and our Canadian identity, I think it's only fair to preface that I think that I exist as a very different Canadian just for everything that I represent. And so there's maybe there's this national identity of super polite and can't do wrong and the world loves us, and we just kind of trap ourselves in that and allow it to negate certain things that don't fit into that self-concept. I'm on the other end of that, and so the damaging end of this ongoing belief and false narrative and the veil that is being put over sort of that end in terms of it going this how we see ourselves as Canadian. I think I'm a little bit biased or skewed in how I can answer that, if I'm being fair. In terms of what maybe stood out, I think at the top of my head, I think it really depends on what the author was trying to do. And then even with that, can you or should you trust the audience to fully understand it? So something that stood out to me is that there's seemingly, okay, so I'm gonna focus on who I wasn't certain of Rashad, but I'm gonna focus on more Miles and Sean. And it's what stood out to me is that you have Sean, who in society would be kind of maybe deemed as a lower position in terms of what they're doing, right? And how that character is embodied or captured relative to their language. And then I feel you have Miles is this Harvard grad or so, and kind of almost this assumption or stereotype of what maybe a visible minority or Black person in that role may go about it or speak in a certain way, right? We might anticipate that a Black person who goes to Harvard and holds that position may sound a certain way. And we might anticipate that a Black individual who works at Starbucks and maybe doesn't have that might sound or speak and behave in a certain way. That is something that stood out to me. But again, there's so much hidden meaning and subtlety that I just kind of stood neutral. I cannot assume one way or the next what was intended or if there was any intention behind that. But it is, I mean, whether or not it's something that is kind of, yeah, it's hard to say. I don't know what was trying to be captured by that. I think there's so much hidden meaning and symbolism that might be deliberate, right? Mm-hmm. Or that might be in the most objective way, not critical of the author. That just might have been thoughtless, or you know what I mean, right? No malice behind that, or so, just kind of maybe not considered, maybe considered and just not deemed that important. And I'm kind of going too far with this because I have my own biases between who I am and what I do, right? Yeah, it almost would have been interesting if they flipped that for whatever reason. And the two characters just spoke like Sean spoke like Miles and Miles spoke like Sean, right? And that someone who maybe speaks a little bit more like Sean can exist at Harvard or that high-end job in like that environment. Rather than like, or you might say like, no, well, this is a microcosm of people in this position have to kind of code switch and kind of shed their identity in order to assimilate and feel safe and blend in as far into the background as a visible minority actually can, right? There's so, I don't want to like spiral on this, but
no, I understand that. I understand that.
many levels, right? And like, so again, I'm not going to make any assumptions or whatnot about what was behind that, if anything. That is something, but if you ask the question, it's a really good question. That is something that stood out to me. It is very much something that stood out to me.
Thank you.
Con, we're coming up near the end of our time with you, and so I just want to make sure that if there's any other questions from the group, we get a chance to throw those in.
Jackie?
Yeah, I just had a quick question. First, from a design perspective, I feel like our set is not going to be therapist approved because it's going to be full of triggers, which I think is in a good way. But again, with like what they wear, like I was wondering when you're reading the script, because you're a therapist, were there any kind of textbook things where like, oh, this is totally going to happen? This is, you know what I mean, based on what we know about the characters, and I'm just wanted to know if there was anything that stood out, I guess along the lines of what Carlos asked, and for us, maybe we flip it. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And then, so I'll think about that, but also I'm thinking about like, I find the costumes for this very fun and tricky to do, because I'm just thinking, we were discussing this morning, what snapshot are we revealing and how self-aware are they in what they choose to wear? Even like Miles and Rashad, like if we flipped, like, yeah, the way they speak, but also the way they dress, if we flipped it, what does that mean? Like, what are we saying? There's so many symbolisms, like you're saying, in what they're doing. So for me, like, it's not a struggle, but like, oh, we have to be very careful in what we choose to reveal. So in terms of when you kind of reading the characters, like, this was a little bit too obvious, or this wasn't really obvious, like it'd be, I don't know if you have any kind of thoughts on that.
Okay. So I'm not the most visual of people, but something that might be able to consider is that I think that there might be, and even in my head, I think there might be this reflex assumption that Miles might just have a shaved head. Because I often find that like that is oftentimes deemed to be the safest, like academic, like professional look for Black males. And so like, right, like I can't, like, okay, side note, like when I was accepted into my master's, for instance, I had cornrows. First thing that I did was I shaved my head, and none of my white friends understood why, and all my friends of color did, right? And like, and my literal answer is I didn't want to seem too N-word-ish in terms of my interview to not get in, because I don't feel like I can control my entire experience or have him seen, right? And so that might be something to consider in terms of like, and again, like, I don't know if there's wigs or stuff like that or whatnot, and like, I'm not offending anybody by saying this, but like, if you ask me to be brutally honest, yeah, right? Like, it might be interesting to kind of flip it, right? And so some people might assume Sean has hair closer to this. Who knows, right? Like, because maybe he doesn't have the pressures or the constraints of a corporate world, and the rigidity of like what is deemed acceptable. Maybe Rashad represents like this evolution where like, no, you can be young and kind of at the top and a person of color and like kind of have a little bit of authenticity. Like that off the top of my head is something that stood out to me.
Yeah, because it's like decoding something, right? Like it's, all these assumptions and symbolisms, and it's like layering it, and like they're all decisions, right? And they all reveal character. So it's,
and where's self-expression? I love what you said, Con, about like the character that works at Starbucks being freer to express themselves visually and how they wear themselves, and whether it's tied to their ethnicity or not. Because you see that in the real world too. If you go to cities and like you go to an office and you go to the Starbucks, the kid at Starbucks has rainbow hair, 12 different nail polish colors, you know what I mean? And they're happy. Whether they're happy or not is not up to me, but the expression, the expression of color in one's clothing and in one's environment, I think is part of it. or it can be part of it. To
If you
Jeff's
go, okay, I don't know if you want to actually go this far into it, but like there was also, I think about within the last, yeah, I think it was right around in the last 2 years, there was a like massive incidents with Starbucks and how they were treating Black patrons and just sitting in there and the police called on them.
for the real, yeah.
Might want to kind of think about that in terms of using a Starbucks and a Black employee. I mean, maybe again, maybe this was actually really thought of and like there's a reason for that, but like something to consider.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure.
Mhm.
No doubt.
For sure.
Con, I'm sorry to cut us off because I
Hi.
know that
It's all good.
talking. I also know that you probably have many other things in your day to day because you have at least 6 more jobs to do before nighttime. So I know that I can speak for the table with just our deep gratitude for your time and your energy and your expertise. And thank you, thank you. And we really look forward to having you again at the panel on Sunday.
Yeah.
I'll see you guys there. Have a great rest of your weekend, and I'll see you guys Sunday. Thank you for participating and your time. It really means a lot. And your
Thank you.
team.
Thanks so much, Con.